A new true crime podcast is giving people an inside perspective of a very highly publicized DC murder. In February of this year, Darren Wint was sentenced to 4 life sentences for the murder of a DC power couple, their 10-year-old son, and their housekeeper.
Joining us to talk about the podcast, which is already very popular, is WTOP reporter Cloherty. She covered the trial and hosts 22 Hours in American Nightmare. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us why you made the podcast. Why was it important to you to resurrect this case? Now that it's over a year old, it's kind of faded from memory. What was important to you when you're telling this story?
You know, we work for WTOP, me and my colleague Jack Moore, and we were covering this trial. It was a 6-week trial. We knew it was going to be, just a massive, as far as like planning how you cover it, how you report it every day. And we started going to the trial and realized there was so much detail coming out. And in WTOP, our format's very quick, right? So we had 40 seconds and a web story. And by the time you say what happened and get into who's testifying that day, the details weren't really making it into the reports. And I noticed too of TV reporters and others who were covering it. So we just thought, we know so much more about this crime that's happened in our community. We know there's people who want to know all these facts. So we decided to do more with it.
I mean, these murders captured national attention. I remember covering it when I was at MSNBC. But just for people who don't remember, take us through a little bit of what happened and why this created national fascination.
So it was back on a completely normal day as far as we know, May 2015. A father, a mother, their housekeeper, and the couple's 10-year-old son were taken hostage, the prosecution says one by one by one by one, and held for 22 hours, hence the title of our podcast, tortured and killed. And then the house was set on fire. And this happened, people might remember, like a couple blocks from the vice president's residence. So it's a very upscale area of Washington, D.C., mansions everywhere, and just crime doesn't really happen there. So there was that. But there was also, we thought initially, I remember that day, we thought, okay, there's a fire in this really nice neighborhood, let's go. And then they realized, no, there's people inside. No, there's a child inside. And it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And the trial itself was just so, his defense was that his brothers did it.
Right.
And that didn't happen until the first day of the trial. They had an opening statement and they said, yeah, no, it wasn't him, it was his brothers. And we were just like,
Yeah.
So there was just so much to it. I mean, and you have 4 victims, you have 3 families, another the defendant's family is falling apart because he's blaming his family members. You have another 2 families grieving. It was just drama central, but then all these details, investigatory details that were just interesting.
So what is the prosecution's theory? We're not, the podcast isn't even finished. It's still coming out. I'm glued whenever it does. What is the prosecution's theory? Why did Darren Wint commit these horrific murders for only $40,000?
Yeah, it's really hard to square that. If you're not a murderer, it's hard to it's hard to think how could you possibly. For me, it's funny because as reporters, we never put our thoughts or feelings into any of this. And the prosecution kind of said they had to find, the motive was Darren Wint wanted a lifestyle he couldn't have. He was engaged to be married and couldn't afford a ring. He had a green card. He was here legally from Guyana, but he needed to re-up his green card, and that cost money. So $40,000 will solve all those problems. Is $40,000 worth killing 4 people and a child? Absolutely not, in any sane person's mind, right? But there was never a sign of any planning. There was no searches on his phone, not even an indication on GPS that he looked for the Savopoulos' mansion. I mean, it just kind of was like, what? So in the podcast, we explore, is this something that went wrong?
Right.
Was this initially like a kidnapping and something happened?
Right.
And it was never intended to be this? In doing this, in the 6-week trial, Jack and I would call, you guys can relate to this, you're covering a trial, you have 2 seconds to run outside, call your producer and just say, here's who's testifying, this is the spelling of their name, so you don't get anything wrong. And meanwhile, Jack would record those calls because he wanted to get everything right. But what we ended up with was an audio diary of this entire trial. And there were really hard days for everybody. I mean, not just me, who cares about me, but the family and the jury seeing autopsy photos. And so I came out and I would just call Jack and I was like, how am I even going to report this? What do I even say?
What do I boil this down to?
Right, it was really difficult, I think, for everybody in the courtroom. And so we ended up with kind of going through the trials, a long way to answer your question, but we sort of go through figuring out what happened here with you as you're listening, because we were there breaking it down moment by moment.
Right.
during the trial.
But what about this makes it anything other than an open and shut case? Because you have this guy who's got a connection to the family. They found his DNA
was in the house.
on a pizza crust, right? That's one of the details. A lot of people, that was one of the details I remembered from covering it.
Right.
So what are the questions that remain? It seems like he did it, and he was obviously convicted for it.
100%. No, this is not a whoddunit. We're not trying to say Darren Wint did not do this crime or he was wrongly convicted. By, all accounts, and we sat there the whole time. He did a great defense, and they did a fantastic job. It's the questions that you think when you sit through a trial, everything's going to be laid out like a movie, right? Like all the details are going to fall into place, and you're going to know how he got in the house. Well, we don't. We don't know how he got in the house. We don't know how he took them captive. We don't know why when the firefighters found them, all the victims were cut free. Well, that doesn't make sense if they were being held against their will.
Right.
There are just a ton of questions like in the timeline of how this happened and then what he did afterwards. The day after this crime, he goes to a immigration attorney and puts all of his fingerprints down for the feds to have his fingerprints to get his green card. Is that something that you would do if you had just killed 4 people? There's just a lot of questions that you kind of think, well, maybe it wasn't him.
Yeah.
It's not a whodunit again. It's a how and it's a why.
Well, what was his explanation for how he blamed his brothers? What is he saying there? What is he blaming them for doing? What's his plausible explanation?
It didn't hold up because his cell phone activity goes like completely dead during the 22 hours that this happened, and he has an answer for that. And the prosecution said, we have an answer for everything because you have to.
Right.
But his defense was his brothers had planned this thing. Darren was out of work. They said, hey, will you help us with this job? We need to borrow your van. He had a minivan at the time. So they show up that morning to do the job, and they're like, you know what, we just need your minivan. We don't need you. He's like, okay. So they take his van, leaves his cell phone in the van. That's what he says. And then the next day, which is the day the family and Vera were killed, they invite him. The brothers are like, oh, we need help finishing up this job. They bring him back to the house. There happens to be a pizza sitting there. He has the pizza, puts the pizza back down, and then kind of realizes there's something untoward going on and says, you know what, I don't want anything to do with this, and leaves. Doesn't really hold up when his brother picks him up in a Porsche that he knew his brother didn't own like 5 minutes later, and he was fine getting in the Porsche.
Right.
That obviously wasn't his brother. So like, what's your moral compass here, guy? I don't know. There's so much to it to be, and it's hard because it's not entertainment. This family, you're getting to the hours when people lost their lives and what they were trying to do to try and save their son, and the little clues that we have. Like they were making calls out to the outside world and leaving voice messages that we play for you.
Yes.
And it sounds completely normal. And we don't know them, obviously, but even they called family members and friends, and they said that they sounded completely normal. So the prosecution said you have to believe they're doing absolutely everything they can to try and get their son out of this alive.
So they're making calls while this is all going on.
Yes.
But they're just leaving voices like, hey, it's Amy, how's it going? I'll talk to you later.
Well, mostly to like either keep people away from the house or to make it look like nothing's wrong. The concerning thing that we go into is they made a lot of calls to the security company. Wanted to know how their security camera worked because it was a new system. Was it stored in the cloud? And was the kidnapper making them make those calls?
Wow.
Gotcha.
But just like a maintenance guy showed up at 9 a.m. on the 14th, which is the day they were killed, and they called them back and they're like, yeah, we just had to run out because our son isn't feeling well, so if we could just reschedule.
Wow.
You have someone on the phone, you could have said, help us.
Right.
It seems
but he's saying,
but
if you don't do this.
It was like, if we do everything possible, our son will get out, we'll get out.
Right.
We'll reassure the killer or the kidnapper.
And all of these
obviously
people
didn't end.
who talked to them.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then it's bizarre. Like you said, you could never understand what goes on in the mind of a person like this. But all this for $40,000, and that they're held and that they're tortured and like the whole thing. Like it seems like you could have gotten the $40,000 without having to do all of those things.
Right. And our theory with the $40,000 lines up with the prosecution's is that same thing that they're trying to make sure their son gets out alive. So Sava Savopoulos, who was the father in this, ran a construction company, an ironworks company. Construction, there's a lot of access to cash. So he calls the morning of, or actually the night before, and says, I need to take out a lot of cash. Well, it wasn't necessarily, he'd done that before.
Yeah, it's not a weird thing.
He would go to these auctions and buy like very specialized equipment, and you'd need tens of thousands of dollars to do that. And so he called, and I think, and the prosecution thinks, he picked a number that like wasn't gonna raise a red flag. If he said, I need $1 million,
then they'd be like, what's going on
Then his
here?
family's gonna be like, oh, that's weird, you know, because his family were part of the business. But if he says, I need 40 grand, they're like, okay, when do you need it by? You know, so I have a feeling that that's why he did that. So, because he was trying to maybe reassure the intruder at that point, you can get away with this. You can leave us, you know, and we won't tell anybody.
What questions to you are still unanswered?
There's like dozens.
What are the ones that
question for
really
a
drive
journalist,
you crazy?
Well, yeah, it is a perfect question.
Yeah.
So we interviewed, after she took the stand, we interviewed the housekeeper, another housekeeper the family had who'd worked there for 20 years. And she'd already testified, and she's sitting in the back of the court trying to get the answers to her questions, and sees something in a crime scene photo that any of us would have just looked at it and been like, huh. She goes, oh, the trash is empty. Okay, so the trash is empty. And she goes, no, I think I know how he got in because of that. That was one of the last things we did every day. And so we talk about that in the episode, but basically she thinks that they took the trash out through the garage, and that's when he slips inside. So that was one of the questions.
Yeah.
How did he get in?
Yeah.
Another question was, you know, when he goes to pick up the pizza gets delivered to Domino's Pizza from Tenleytown. 2 pizzas, he opens the door and he looks up at the security cameras looking right at him. And is that the point where this crime goes from being a extortion, kidnapping, to something much more dire?
Like, gotcha.
Yeah.
Because he thinks, oh my gosh, I'm on this camera, I'm never gonna get out of this. I have to kill the people who've seen me. I mean, again, it's hard because you don't want to speculate. This is all based off of call records and you know, glass breaks that alerted on the security system. And you kind of have these gaps in the timeline, and they could have gone 8 different ways. And so what makes the most sense? And part of me as a journalist is like, well, we're never going to know because I don't have the facts to support it. But there are breadcrumbs, you know, and we sort of kind of go down that trail with you and kind of let you decide what happened, basically.
Well, it's a phenomenal podcast.
Thank you.
Glued. we can't stop discussing the details
I haven't listened, but now I'm going to have to.
Yeah, it's like
Now you have to.
it is so good, and thank you for shining a light on this. I think it's just a very fascinating way to look at how the criminal justice system operates, even when you're relatively certain that there can be a lot of questions that are still unanswered.
Yeah.
Yes, it was one of the prosecution said, you know, we don't have to say how he did this, it's that he did this.
Right.
And so it was a civics lesson, really.
Yeah.
I mean, when we were in there, just seeing how they were able to prove their case.
How do we find it?
Yeah.
It's on Apple Podcasts. It's on Podcast One, and really wherever you get your podcasts, called 22 Hours: An American Nightmare.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.